Montana Territory, 1874. The wind cut sharp across the high plains as the stagecoach rolled into the quiet town of Red Rock, wheels grinding against frost-bitten earth. Inside sat a woman with her hands clenched tight in her lap, her hat brim pulled low to shadow her face. Her name was Beatrice June Jensen, and she had traveled over 1,000 miles from Missouri to marry a man who had stopped writing 2 weeks ago. She stepped down from the coach with a battered carpet bag and no welcome waiting. The townsfolk barely glanced her way. One man on the sidewalk muttered, "That her? Poor fella." Another woman whispered behind a gloved hand, said she was plain, but I didn't think he meant that plain. Beatrice's cheeks flared red beneath the cold. Her heart thudded, but she kept walking, one boot in front of the other, toward the small post office where she was supposed to meet her intended a widower farmer named Thomas Granger, who had written in neat, hopeful script about needing a wife to help raise his 2 children. Inside, the postmaster looked up and frowned. "You Beatrice Jensen?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, sir, I was expecting Thomas Granger." The man scratched his beard. "Granger left town last week, said he changed his mind." Beatrice didn't speak. The words stung more than anything she had braced for. She had no family left, no money to return east, and now no husband waiting. The postmaster studied her face, then looked away. "Said you sent a picture with your letter. Guess he didn't like what he saw." Beatrice stood there, her jaw tight. After a few seconds, she turned and walked out without another word. She wandered for the better part of the day, the cold pressing against her thin coat as she clutched her bag. The sun dipped low behind the hills before she found herself outside the livery, staring at saddled horses and a man tossing hay to them. He turned when he heard her boots crunch the snow. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a thick winter coat and a calm way of standing like nothing could push him over. His eyes were pale green, steady as the land he worked. "You lost?" he asked. "I suppose I am," she said. "Name's Beatrice Jensen. I was meant to marry a man here." But he changed his mind. He took a few steps closer, eyes narrowing just a little. "Granger?" "Yes." The man sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Figures, he is a fool." Beatrice blinked, surprised by the calm certainty in his voice. He stuck out a gloved hand. "Kellan O'Rourke. I run a cattle ranch about 10 miles north of here." She hesitated before shaking his hand. His palm was rough and warm. "You came all this way alone?" he asked. She nodded. "He has 2 children, or had. I thought maybe I could belong somewhere." Kellan looked down, then back up at her face. He didn't flinch or look away like the others had. "You hungry?" She hadn't eaten since dawn. "Yes." "Come on, then." He grabbed a coat from the hook and motioned to his wagon hitched nearby. The ride to his ranch was quiet. Snow dusted the trees as they rode through the hills, and night settled in slow and heavy. Beatrice sat stiff beside him, her mind spinning, her heart aching. She expected a small shack. Instead, the ranch house was wide and solid, with smoke curling from the chimney and warm light spilling from the windows. Inside, it smelled of stew and wood fire. 2 children sat at the table. A boy of 8 with dark hair and a sharp chin looked up with suspicion. A girl of maybe 6 with a missing front tooth stared openly. "This is Miss Jensen," Kellan said as he hung his coat. "She is staying with us for a little while." The boy frowned. "Why?" "Because she needs a place and we have one." Beatrice stood awkwardly, every nerve raw. Kellan set her bag down near the stairs. "You are welcome here, Beatrice. No one is turning you away." She looked at him then, really looked. There was no pity in his face, just quiet certainty. "I do not want charity," she said. "And I am not offering it." Later, after the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Beatrice sat at the hearth with tea in her hands. Kellan sat across from her, sharpening a knife slowly. "Granger was a fool," he said again, not looking up. "You do not have to say that." "I am not saying it for you," Kellan said. "I am saying it because it's true." Beatrice swallowed hard. "Everyone says I am too plain, too old, too ugly." Kellan looked up then, his eyes steady. "They are wrong." She held his gaze. He did not flinch. He did not look away. She did not know what to say to that. Over the next few days, she stayed in the small guest room upstairs. She helped in the kitchen, swept the porch, and read to the children in the evenings. The girl Katie warmed to her quickly. The boy, Kyle, took longer, but he watched her closely, always listening. Kellan worked the land each day, rising before dawn, coming home with dust and sweat on his brow. He never asked more of her than she offered, but he noticed everything: how she folded the linens, how she braided Katie's hair, how she stitched Kyle's torn shirt. One night, after the children were in bed, she stood outside on the porch, staring up at the stars. The sky was so wide here. She felt small beneath it. "You thinking of leaving?" Kellan asked, stepping beside her. "I have nowhere else to go." "You have here," he said, voice low. She looked at him. "Why are you being kind to me?" His jaw flexed. "Because I see you." Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. "I see how you care for my kids. I see how strong you are. You are not ugly, Beatrice, not even close." She blinked. "You do not have to say that." "I am not saying it because I have to." He stepped closer, slow and careful. She did not move away. "You are not what they said," he said. "You are better." She looked up at him, her heart pounding, and for the first time in weeks she believed it. The thaw came slow that spring, the last snow melting into the ruts between the pasture fences as April crept over the land. Beatrice woke each morning to the sound of creaking wood and distant cattle lowing, the smell of damp earth and firewood smoke curling through the upstairs window. Kellan had taken to leaving coffee on the stove before heading out, and she drank it on the porch with Katie nestled against her side, still warm from sleep. It was Katie who started calling her Miss B, the name sticking so easily it felt like it had been hers all along. Kyle didn't call her anything at first, but he no longer avoided her eyes, and he'd begun to bring her little things: a smoothed stone, a feather, a scrap of thread he thought she might use. One morning, Kellan paused in the doorway before heading out with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. "You ever handled a horse, B?" She shook her head. "Only rode one when I had to." He nodded once. "You willing to learn?" She looked down at her hands. "I can try." "Come on then." She followed him out to the barnyard, the cold mud sucking at her boots. The air smelled of hay and animals, and the bay gelding in the first stall snorted softly when she approached. Kellan stood beside the horse, rubbing its neck with a quiet hand. "This one's named Boone, gentle but stubborn. Like most good-hearted things." She reached up, slow and unsure, and ran her fingers through Boone's coarse mane. He didn't flinch. "Start by brushing him." "Won't do to work an animal you haven't taken the time to tend." He handed her the curry comb, and she worked in even circles, her arm burning after a while. Kellan stayed nearby, correcting her once or twice, but mostly letting her figure it out. That became their rhythm. After breakfast and cleaning, she walked with Katie to the small schoolhouse down the road, then returned to the ranch to help Kellan with the midday chores. They didn't speak much while they worked, but there was a comfort in the quiet, in the way he passed her tools without asking, in the way their steps began to match. She asked questions when she needed to. He answered with the kind of patience that didn't draw attention to itself. One afternoon, as she was gathering eggs from the henhouse, he leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "You always been so careful?" he asked. She looked up. "Careful with the way you move. Like you're expecting something to go wrong." She didn't answer right away, placing the last egg into the basket before turning toward him. "I lived with a cousin for a while after my parents passed. Her husband was a man who didn't like noise. Or mistakes." Kellan's expression didn't shift, but his stance changed, somehow less at ease, more solid. "You're safe here," he said. "Not soft, not loud, just true." "I know," she said. "But knowing and feeling are two different things." That evening, after supper and dishes, Kyle surprised her by asking if she'd help him with his writing lesson. He'd been slow to take interest in schoolwork, but he sat at the table without fidgeting, his pencil clutched tight, eyes darting up to hers each time he finished a line. "You've got a steady hand," she said, tapping the page gently. "I want Pa to be proud," he said, voice low. She glanced toward the window where Kellan stood outside splitting kindling. "He already is," she said. Kyle didn't answer, but a tiny smile lifted the corner of his mouth. Later, when the children were asleep, Kellan came in with his shoulders dusted in sawdust and his hands chapped raw. Beatrice poured 2 mugs of warm cider and handed him one without a word. They sat by the fire again, the silence easier than it had been weeks ago. "She's taking to you," Kellan said, nodding toward the stairs. "She's easy to love," Beatrice answered. "Kyle too," he added after a beat. "Yes," she said, "he just doesn't know it yet." He looked at her then, the firelight catching in the green of his eyes. "You've changed this house," she shook her head. "I've barely been here 2 months, and still," he said, a long pause stretched between them. She reached down and pulled the old quilt tighter around her lap. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. She thought maybe he wouldn't. "I didn't think I would," he said. "But sometimes I catch myself wondering what it would be like to come in from the fields and know someone's waiting, not just for the children's sake, for mine." She held her mug tighter. "I never thought I'd want it again either," she said. "Not after being left behind like that." "Well," he said quietly, "you weren't meant for someone like him." They said nothing else that night, but when she went upstairs, her chest ached in a new way, not from hurt, but from something growing, something she hadn't dared name yet. By May, the cottonwoods along the creek behind the ranch stood full and green, their leaves whispering in the wind like a secret too soft to catch. Beatrice stood knee-deep in the vegetable patch, sleeves rolled and apron dusted with soil, planting rows of beans Kellan had traded for down in Red Rock. Her hands moved steady, but her thoughts wandered. The night before, Kellan had placed a small wooden box in her hands without a word. Inside were 6 buttons, carved from elk horn and polished smooth. She hadn't dared ask where he'd gotten them, but she'd known. Kyle's coat had needed mending, and she'd mentioned just once that the buttons were mismatched and brittle. Kellan had remembered. She hadn't known what to say then. She didn't know now. The sound of hooves slowed at the gate. She looked up to see Kellan riding in, his posture bent just enough to suggest weariness. The cattle had been pushing at the northern fence line again, not trouble yet, but he'd been watching it close. He dismounted and tied the reins, giving her a nod as he passed. "Something wrong with the fence?" she asked. He pulled his gloves off, shaking dust from the fingers. 3 posts leaning, ground soft from the spring melt. "I'll reinforce them tomorrow." She brushed her palms together and stepped out of the garden. "I can help." He looked at her, not with doubt but calculation. "Fence work's heavy, you sure?" "I'm not made of glass." That earned a quiet sound from him, not quite a laugh, but not dismissal either. "I know that," he said. "I just don't want you pulling your shoulder like last week." "I'll mind it." He tilted his head, eyes measuring. "All right then, we'll leave early." The following morning they loaded the wagon with rails and tools. Katie stayed behind with Mrs. Tolliver, the widow who lived a half-mile east and had taken to watching the children when needed. Kyle rode with them, quiet but alert, sitting between them with his hands in his lap. Out at the fence line, the work was slow. Kellan dug out the leaning posts while Beatrice held them steady, her boots slipping in the mud more than once. Kyle fetched nails and wire without being asked, watching everything with a quiet hunger to learn. They paused near midday, sitting on a fallen log to eat cold biscuits and dried apples. Beatrice took her tea plain, the metal cup warm between her palms. Kyle looked up at Kellan. "Are we gonna brand this year?" Kellan wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "We'll start next week. You'll help with the sorting." Kyle nodded, then glanced at Beatrice. "Can she help too?" Beatrice raised a brow. "I don't know the first thing about branding." "You'd learn," Kyle said. "You learn fast." The boy didn't look at his father as he said it, but Kellan's gaze lingered on him, then on her. "You'd be welcome," Kellan said. "If you want to, I'll think on it." Later, as they loaded the last of the tools back into the wagon, thunder rolled faint and distant across the hills. Kellan looked west, his jaw tightening. "We'll ride fast. Storm's moving quicker than I thought." They made it halfway before the rain hit. It came in sheets, sudden and cold, soaking through coats and plastering hair to skin. Kellan pulled the wagon under a thicket of pine and they huddled beneath the canvas until the worst had passed. Beatrice shivered beside him, her teeth clenched to keep from chattering. Kellan slid his coat over her shoulders without asking. "You'll freeze," she said. "I've weathered worse." She looked at him, soaked to the bone and still steady. "You always take care of everyone else," she said. He met her eyes. "Not out of duty, I just don't like watching people go cold when I can do something about it." She held his gaze. "You ever let anyone take care of you?" He didn't answer right away. Rain dripped in slow rhythm from the branches above. "Once," he said. "A long time ago." "What happened?" "She died before spring." The wind gusted, sharp and wet. Beatrice reached beneath the coat and found his hand. It was rough and chilled, but he didn't pull away. "I'm not her," she said. "I know." They sat that way until the rain eased and the smell of wet pine filled the air. By the time they made it back, the sun was low, the land gold and quiet beneath them. Kyle climbed down and ran ahead to check on Katie. Beatrice gathered the tools while Kellan unhitched the horses. As she turned to carry the last of the rails to the shed, Kellan caught her wrist gently. "You meant what you said. About not being made of glass," she nodded. "Then you should know," he said, voice low. "I've been thinking of you more than I should." Not just in passing, her breath caught, but she said nothing. "I'm not asking for an answer now, but I wanted you to know." She stared at him, the last of the light catching in her damp hair, her skin still chilled from the storm. "I'll think on it," she said again. And he nodded, letting go of her wrist with a touch that lingered longer than it needed to. The branding season came with heat that clung to the skin and dust that settled in every crease of clothing. Beatrice stood at the edge of the corral, sleeves rolled and hair tucked beneath a scarf, watching as Kellan moved among the cattle, his motions sure and spare. Kyle worked beside him, smaller but mirroring each task with a quiet hunger. She'd agreed to help not out of obligation, but because she wanted to understand the rhythm of the land that held Kellan's life in its hands. He'd handed her a ledger and a piece of chalk, and she kept count as calves were driven in and marked, one by one. By late afternoon, her throat was dry and her hands ached, but she didn't step away. Kellan glanced over once, his mouth drawn with focus, and gave a single nod. Not encouragement, acknowledgement. When the sun dropped low, they left the last calf penned and walked back to the house in silence. Kyle ran ahead to wash and Kellan carried the branding iron still faintly warm. Beatrice walked beside him, her boots dragging through the dry grass. "You didn't flinch once," he said. She looked down at her hands, dust pressed under her nails. "I've done harder things." "Just not on a ranch." He stopped walking. She turned to face him. "I want you to have something," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside was a brooch, simple but finely made brass with a carved forget-me-not, the kind that bloomed just after the last snow in the far field. She ran her thumb over the shape, the metal still warm from where it had rested against his chest. "It belonged to my mother," he said. She wore it pinned to her apron when she worked, her breath caught. "You should keep it for Katie." "I will," he said, "but I want her to see it on someone who knows how to stay." She looked up, his meaning as clear as the dusk light on his face. "I don't know what kind of woman I am here," she said. "You're the kind who earns a place without asking," he said. "The kind who changes the feel of a room just by being in it." She held the brooch against her palm. "I thought I'd come west to be someone's wife. I didn't expect to find myself." He stepped closer. "You didn't come here to be chosen, you came to choose." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. Inside, Katie was singing to herself as she set the table, her thin braid bouncing with each step. Kyle sat sharpening a pencil with care, the stub of his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth. Beatrice pinned the brooch to her collar before joining them. Neither child said anything, but Kyle's eyes darted to it, then to his father and back again. Something settled in his shoulders. That night, after the children had gone upstairs, Kellan lingered in the doorway to the front room. Beatrice was sewing a patch onto one of Kyle's worn shirts, the firelight catching on the brass at her throat. "I've thought about asking you to stay," he said. She didn't look up. "You already have, just not in words." "I don't want to give you my land," he said. "I want to offer you my life. It's not the same." She set the shirt down, her fingers resting lightly on the cloth. "You sure?" "I've never been more." She stood and crossed to him, slow and steady. "Then ask me." He took her hands. "Beatrice Jensen, will you build a life here with me?" She folded her fingers around his. "Yes, I will." They stood like that for a long time, the fire burning low, the house quiet but not empty. Nothing had come easy, but the hard things had carved room for something honest and firm and deeply rooted. Outside, the wind carried the smell of warmed earth and distant lilac. The ranch had changed her, shaped her like water shapes stone, not by force, but by presence. She had come west to be wanted. She had stayed to be loved. The wedding was held on a clear June morning under the cottonwoods by the creek, where the grass grew soft and tall and the air smelled of wild mint. Kellan stood beside Reverend Ames in a clean white shirt and the dark vest Beatrice had mended herself, the buttons smooth and even along the front. Katie clutched a small bouquet of prairie flowers tied with a strip of blue calico, her chin lifted with pride. Kyle kept mostly to himself, his hands shoved in his pockets, but his boots were polished, and he hadn't let go of the small tin ring he'd fashioned for her out of an old tobacco lid. Beatrice came down between the trees with her hands bare and her hair tied back in a ribbon the color of river clay. She wore a simple dress of cream muslin, one she'd sewn the previous winter, and pinned at her collar was the brooch Kellan had given her, the forget-me-not catching the sun. She met his eyes without hesitation, her back straight and her step sure. "I kept thinking I'd feel afraid," she said once they stood together. "But I don't. I think we've already done the hard part," he said. Reverend Ames kept the ceremony brief, his voice low and even. When Kellan slid the ring onto her finger, a modest gold band she hadn't seen until that moment, her breath hitched just once. She hadn't asked for anything fine. He'd gotten it anyway. Afterward, Mrs. Tolliver spread a tablecloth over a borrowed trestle table and laid out enough food to feed 3 families. The townsfolk stayed longer than expected. Some brought pies. One man brought a fiddle. Katie danced in circles until she fell over laughing, and Kyle, without being asked, fetched a plate for Beatrice and made sure she'd tried the pickled beets. Kellan didn't leave her side for long. When the sun began to drop behind the ridge and the others started toward their wagons, he touched her elbow and nodded toward the barn. "I've got something else," he said. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of sawdust. A single oil lamp lit the corner. He led her past the stalls and opened the door to the small room off the back, the one that had been used for storage since, before last winter. The floor had been swept clean. A narrow bed stood against the wall, with a quilt she recognized, one she'd stitched through the colder months. A washstand stood near the window, and a chest with iron hinges rested at the foot of the bed. "I thought we could start here," he said. "Till the upstairs room's ready." She stepped inside, touched the edge of the quilt. "You made this for me, I made it for us." She turned to him. "I never expected to have this, not after the way things began." "I didn't expect you," he said. "And still, you came." She stepped closer and laid her hand against his chest. "I'm not going anywhere." He bent his head and kissed her, slow and certain, his hand finding the curve of her jaw. It wasn't the kind of kiss that came from heat or haste, it was the kind that came after long work and quiet waiting. The kind that said, "I am here. I am yours." That night, after the children had gone to bed and the house had gone still, they sat side by side on the edge of the barn room bed, her head against his shoulder, his arm resting across her back. "I keep thinking about your mother," she said. "How she wore that brooch with her apron. I wonder if she'd have liked me." "She'd have loved you," he said. "She'd have seen what I see." "And what's that?" He turned to her, his voice low. "A woman who doesn't run from the hard things, who holds a home together with thread and will, who makes a place into something worth coming back to." She didn't answer, just leaned into him with a long exhale, her eyes closing against his shoulder. It was nearly midnight when he lifted her hand and kissed her fingers one at a time. "We could have missed each other," he said. But we didn't. In the seasons that followed, the house grew fuller not just with chores and small repairs, but with the sound of laughter at supper, with books shared by firelight, with two children who slowly stopped looking over their shoulders and started pressing forward. Beatrice planted a new garden near the kitchen, and Kellan built a fence around it before the frost returned. Kyle began calling her Ma in the fall, not because anyone asked him to, but because it fit. Katie climbed into her lap one evening and whispered, "I knew you'd stay," as if it had always been certain. By the next spring, Beatrice's belly swelled beneath her dress. She still worked the fields when she could, still rose early to tend the fire, but Kellan took to walking beside her more often, one hand resting at the small of her back, not as a shield, but as a promise. The land didn't soften, not for them. There were still storms, still fence posts to mend and calves to pull in the cold. But the weight of it was shared now, and that made all the difference. At night, she lay beside him with the windows open to the sound of wind in the cottonwoods, her hand resting over the child growing beneath her ribs, his thumb brushing the inside of her wrist, like he was counting the days. And when he whispered her name just once before sleep took them, she answered with a smile that didn't need to be seen to be known. She didn't come west to be chosen, she came to choose, and she had. And she did.